your height. Deal. I'm originally from Dalton, Georgia. I was born, it's a small town in northwest Georgia. I was born in 1944. And 22 years later, in the spring of 1966, I graduated from the University of Georgia on schedule. And I was scheduled to start law school in the fall of 1966. But my life was, at that point, was proceeding pretty much according to my plan, but things were about to change. And I wasn't as prepared for the military as Dennis was. Dennis is a tough act to follow. In 1966, when I graduated, we were having the highest draft calls in the history of the Vietnam War, and the public was absorbed by news about this war. In 1966, according to the charts, the Battle of the Three Berets was the #1 song for the year. The best-selling book was The Green Berets. And the movie, The Green Berets, with John Wayne, was the introduction for The Green Berets. And it would be the movie of the year in the year in which it was released. So, I graduated in June, and in August of 1966, while I was waiting on my September class day for law school, a member of the local draft board told my father I was going to be drafted in October. So I had a September class day from law school and an October draft day. So I notified the law school that I couldn't attend, and I started looking into officer candidate programs. I had only 2 months to make a decision before I was drafted. I talked to the Navy, I talked to the Air Force, and I talked to the Army. And only the Army could guarantee me that my application would be processed within 2 months. The others told me it would be 3 or 4 months or longer. So I was off to the Army. In return for my commitment to the Army, I got a one-way bus ticket to Fort Benning, Georgia. Fort Benning, the name of Fort Benning has been changed to Fort Moore, but it was Fort Benning when I was there, and it will always be Fort Benning to me, so I'm going to refer to it that way. I arrived at Fort Benning for 2 months of basic training, then I had 2 months of advanced infantry training at Fort McClellan, Alabama, and then I enrolled in the Officer Candidate School, which was a 6-month course. In the 4th week, Officer Candidate School, following a protocol that they had established before the war, they allowed officer candidates to come in and make special requests for where we would be assigned after we graduated. And the reality is, we all knew, in a wartime OCS program, we were likely going to be platoon leaders on the front lines. But nevertheless, we got to state preferences, and so I stated, #1, I wanted to be in intelligence. I wanted to be assigned to Germany. The James Bond movies had made that sound very intriguing. And for #2, I put psychological operations because I presumed that was a desk job in Saigon. When we got to #3, I didn't have an obvious choice. And the Special Forces alluring with all the attention it got. But there was a rumor circulating that Special Forces officers in Vietnam didn't survive their first year. So I was afraid to volunteer for it. But then I started thinking, in the officer candidate class ahead of me, more than half the people had volunteered for Special Forces and no one had gotten it. And in my class, there was a large number of people, perhaps approaching half, who had put down Special Forces for their first choice. And so I figured if I put it down 3rd, there was no chance I could get it. And that it made me get more likely that I would get one of my first 2 choices if I couldn't get my 3rd. Officer Candidate School, Wartime Officer Candidate School, was an intense program. About a year after I graduated, they had a congressional investigation there because there was too much attrition and too many injuries. The training was too intense, it was counterproductive for the military. They made them cut it back. But when I was there, it was before the investigation, and the training was very difficult. In the 18th week of officer candidate school, we were senior candidates and we were eligible to receive our orders. We were all anxious for them. One day when we were in formation, at the end of the day, or reveille, one of my fellow officer candidates who had been out for the day because he had torn up his knee and couldn't participate in the training, came hobbling out toward the formation, which was unusual, and he called everyone's attention. And he yelled, "Our orders are in! Our orders are in!" And so, of course, we all were eager to find out where we were going. And then he said, "Where's Chitwood?" So you can imagine, the formation I was in was about 200 officer candidates. And I was being singled out. Typically in officer school, that wasn't a good thing. And my mind was racing. I couldn't imagine what I could have done to a group of 200. And then he yelled, "You got special forces." And I was shell-shocked. I stood there, I didn't respond, I didn't know what to say, I didn't even know what to think. And people around me were patting me on the back and wanting to shake my hand and say congratulations. And all I could remember was that rumor about Special Forces officers didn't survive their first year in Vietnam. My second thought was that I didn't want any more training. Listen, everybody in my officer candidate school class had been through 10 months of training already. We were over it. None of us wanted to have another day. And everyone else was going on to their regular assignments. But I was going into more training, and in some aspects more intense training than I had been through before. At any rate, I graduated from officer candidate school. And that's me, my mouth open there. That's when the guy yelled, "You got special forces." Or at least it's a facsimile. So my next assignment was the jump school, the airborne school at Fort Benning. All special forces troops have to be airborne qualified. From there, I went to Fort Bragg, Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg, which is the legendary home of Special Forces in the 2nd Airborne Division and the 173rd. And Fort Bragg is legendary. As many of you know, it's used in Hollywood movies for character exposition to show that someone has had very special training and has special skills. So those of us who have been to Fort Bragg are proud of our history there. And I want to point out one more thing here. My friend Hanson was there at the same time I was. He was also in the Noel was in the medical corps and I was in field training, so we didn't know each other. But when we spoke here, we realized that we were there at overlapping times. We graduated from school at the same time. I think we're probably the same age. And Fort Bragg has another special meaning to Noel and Char. Their daughter was born there.
Yes.
So, my next assignment was Vietnam. Special Forces officers are supposed to be fluent in the language of the country to which they're assigned. And I was supposed to go to the language school in Monterey, up the coast, to learn to speak Vietnamese. But they were short of officers in Vietnam, and they had a program where they allowed us to skip that year of language training in return for getting out of the service early, later. And I took that. My ambition was still to go to law school. My assignment in Vietnam, let me mention a couple of things. I'm using the term Special Forces and Green Beret. The reason for that is that they are interchangeable. Special Forces is the official name of the unit to which I was assigned. It's a capital S, capital F. Green Beret is an AKA or a nickname just based on the headgear we wore. So the name Special Forces for the capital S and F applies only to the Green Berets and not to another unit, which causes some confusion. Special Forces also has special terminology. The conventional Army has divisions, battalions, companies, platoons, and squads, but Special Forces has only A, B, and C companies. The A teams, which were the ones you typically hear about, are the ones who fought. I was assigned to an A team almost the entire time I was in Vietnam. And all A team operations were small team operations. It says here, because I got this off the internet, that there were usually 8 to 12 men assigned. But the reality, when I was there, they were short personnel. We never had more than 8 or less than 7. So most of our operations were behind enemy lines. I spent more time in Cambodia than I did in Vietnam. The next level up from an A team is a B team, and the B teams just are the support organizations for the A teams. As you know, even in a war, the people who are in the military aren't actually on the front lines fighting, they're in support roles. The B team played a very important role because they provided logistics and supply and intelligence to us, and they coordinated with other military units. We only coordinated with other military units through the B team. There was a C team, it was a high-level command and control, the only one in Vietnam.
That picture of you?
Oh yeah, that's me. That's me. Actually, that photo was one of the few I have. Of course, we didn't have cell phones. That's me on a Special Forces A team in Vietnam, out in the field. A little terminology to help with my explaining things is the South Vietnamese Army they were our allies. We were fighting for them, and they were called ARVN. And ARVN stands for Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The enemy with the North Vietnamese Army were NVA and the Viet Cong, who were VC. When I arrived in Vietnam, it was right after the Tet offensive. Probably many of you, most of you, remember Tet. It was the height of the Vietnam War, and it's when the NVA and VC had attacks against military installations all over South Vietnam. I got there right after Tet, and the military learned 2 big lessons from Tet. Number one is that they were capable, the enemy was capable of having these big operations, and that the next one they were planning was an attack on Saigon. The second lesson we learned is that we had to give more support to the South Vietnamese units. They frequently lost battles and were overrun because they had no access to air power and artillery the way American units did. When I was assigned to an A team, I was assigned to one in a position to play a major role in addressing both of those problems. Problem number one, we were the first line of defense against an attack on Saigon. If you look at this in white is Vietnam. Many of you know Vietnam's a long, narrow country, and Saigon is in Freeport, very near where the Mekong River comes out of Cambodia. My A team was located right on the Cambodian border and right where the Mekong comes out. When the North Vietnamese were shipping soldiers and supplies to Freeport, they were more likely to use the Mekong River system than they were the Ho Chi Minh Trail, because the Ho Chi Minh Trail was so long. It was truly a trail, it wasn't a road. And we interdicted it, of course. It was very complicated for them to get supplies across that full 800-mile stretch. So instead, they brought them down through the Mekong River system. That whole area there, it was a watershed for draining water out of Southeast Asia through the Mekong River. In the monsoon system, there was a water in South Vietnam. Sometimes it was 2 feet deep, even at level there. At any rate, our position right there on the Cambodian border and where the Mekong River comes through was designed to keep them from moving troops and supplies through to set up an operation to take Saigon. We did that a number of ways. We were small teams. We went into Cambodia. We called in airstrikes and artillery in Cambodia before they even got Vietnam. On the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where they still had some traffic, we went in small teams and set up explosives on bridges. They had makeshift bridges because they had a bridge that was there very long. We would blow it up. They didn't last very long. We even went in one night and put explosives on the bridge that was guarded. They weren't paying attention and they didn't see us. And we planted the explosions and then set them off remotely. And then we had to get the hell out of there because they obviously knew we were there, and they were not happy. This is a better thing. This is a better slide of my area of responsibility there, or my 18th area. You can see that when they're bringing supplies down the Mekong River, as the right where my 18 was. Problem number 2. The armed forces, the Army of the Republic of South Vietnam, lacked air power, and they weren't allowed to call in, and we didn't allow them to call in U.S. support. Because it required special training. And during TAT, a number of the armed units were overpowered and had 100% casualties. And what I mean by this is that they were in conflicts with North Vietnamese Army. They were overrun, and the North Vietnamese Army didn't take prisoners. They had no facility for them. They had no way to house them. They had no way to transport them. They had no way to care for them. So when they overran a South Vietnamese position, they killed everybody. There was never a survivor. And as they were our allies in the special forces, we were assigned to solve that problem. The solution we came up with was to get a special forces officer on the ground with when a Vietnamese unit, a South Vietnamese unit, was under siege. And as you can imagine, that was a difficult process. The mission of the course of the Special Forces officer was to call in U.S. air and artillery support, and this required, what Special Forces set up for this was special teams, ad hoc teams that we call mobile strike teams, or Mike Force teams for short. So what was a Mike Force team? I'm going to focus on this for the rest of my talk because running Mike Force operations was the thing I was known for in Vietnam. When I first got there, they were just starting the Mike Force program. I was one of the first officers to be assigned to a Mike Force operation. But thereafter, I started getting a lot of assignments, and I found out later they were calling me first. There were 4 A teams in South Vietnam, but I was getting the first call. I think this was not a plot assignment. So the compensation of a Special Forces team, Mike Force Special Forces officer for my A team, that would have been me. During the latter part of my service, I was the only officer of my A team. A radio operator and a helicopter team to insert us. Now the helicopter team was composed of a UH-1B, which is just a standard transport helicopter. We called them sleds because they didn't have munitions. And 4 to 6 Apache assault choppers, and I don't know if you're familiar with Apache assault choppers, but those are lethal weapons of war. Mounted under the front of the chopper was a 30-mike machine gun, and they had short, chunky wings on the sides, and they had Hellfire missiles. And when they came in and made an attack, it just lit up the whole area. So the way we were able to get a Special Forces officer in with this team was with the support of the chopper team. So let me give you an example. And I'll use for the example the first Mike Force operation I ever ran. What happened is we got 20 minutes notice. These were ad hoc teams, and we got a call on the A team that they said, you have a Mike Force operation, you have 20 minutes notice, the chopper will be in your location, ETA, 20 minutes. So I grab my gear, grab the radio man. 20 minutes later, the 1B arrives, supported by an Apache helicopter team. Helicopter ran out to the UH-1B and jumped on board. And at the time that I got on board, all I knew is that I was going out for a Mike Force mission. I didn't have any other information about it. So once on board the chopper, I climbed forward between the pilot and the co-pilot, and one of them showed me a map. And listen, inside a chopper is a very noisy, windy place. It's very difficult to have a conversation. So to say that we were talking, I'm holding this wrong, I realize. To say that we were having a conversation doesn't mean we were talking, we were shouting. And they shouted to me, they showed me a map, shouted to me that they had circled the place they were going to drop me off, and they told me which direction the friendly and enemy forces were. At the time the chopper came in for the insertion, that's all the information I had. So what we did is, the way we did this insertion, well, I'll mention my gear. I had a topological map, a compass, a protractor, and double basic load of ammunition, and other gear. Can you change it? Yeah. So this is hard to visualize, but let me tell you how it was set up. We have the enemy forces in red and the friendly forces in green. The Apache team comes in over the top of the friendly forces and dives down toward the enemy forces, getting fire superiority, or at least the idea of it. If you're in the enemy positions there and 4 to 6 Apache helicopters are attacking you, you duck. You get your head down. And the idea with that Apache team is for them to keep their attention while the UH-1B came in, represented by the purple arrow, with my radio man and me, and land behind the friendly forces. Once I said land, they did land, the chopper comes, they get low, they reduce their speed, and we had to jump out. And one of the things I learned on subsequent missions is to tell them, make sure you get lower than 10 feet. Because the chopper pilots were so anxious to get out of there. They wouldn't slow down enough or go low enough, but we had to jump. So, at any rate, when we jumped off, I knew which direction to go.
Yeah.
And I got in the direction of the friendly forces who were expecting us. And they formed a cordon when I got there. And I lay down in the middle of it with a map, compass, and got on the phone. And they told me, the B team, which I reported to, told me whether we had artillery or air support, because sometimes we had one, sometimes we had the other, and I never knew until I got there. In this particular case, it had artillery, and it put me in touch, my radio man put me in touch with the artillery fire base. And from there, I called in artillery, and calling in artillery is hard, really, because you have to walk it in. You obviously don't want to have an artillery round land on your own position, or in a nearby village, or it must be very specifically directed. So what you do is you call in first a spotter round, and then, if necessary, other spotter rounds until you can find one, until you get one to land exactly on target, and then you give the command fire for effect. And when an artillery fire base fires for effect, it's hell. I mean, the whole area explodes. So typically, when we got there, it didn't matter what the circumstances were. Otherwise, we were going to win that battle. The issue was that they could attack us before we got the rounds in. And so it was always a panic to get those rounds in as soon as we could, yet make sure they were perfectly accurate. I don't know why I was singled out to fly more of those Mike Force operations than others, but what I have to think is because when I did the first one, it turned out all right, so that just So they just started calling me. I didn't realize at first. I was flying a disproportionate number. But later when I found out, I assumed it was because we were doing a reasonable job. Next. All right, this is, I didn't emphasize this as we were going through it the first time, but these mine force operations were the operations of last effect. We were not supposed to be called in unless a Vietnamese unit was about to be overrun, and as you know, everyone would be killed. So when we went in, we always thought we were going into a situation where if we didn't win the battle, there would be 100% casualties, and the casualties would include ourselves. So every operation had to be successful. But what really happened, and you can imagine this, is on the battlefield, the South Vietnamese commanders called for my force operation when they were really in an imminent position. So a lot of times when we flew, we didn't have to deal with those circumstances. But a lot of times we did, and we never knew in advance which one it was going to be, and really didn't know except in retrospect whether it was that urgent or not when we went in. Next. When I left Vietnam, I went back to law school as I had planned. A few years later, I started my law firm, and we specialized, limited our practice to securities and antitrust. We had offices in Atlanta and New York. We had 25 attorneys at our height. And in 2015, I retired and moved to Florida. A side note, when I was 40 years old, practicing law and going through my midlife crisis, I wanted to do something creative. So I wrote a screenplay, and CBS picked it up, made it a CBS Movie of the Week. It was the most watched TV movie for that year, and it ended up being shown in 136 countries. If you look on the right side, it says written by Martin Chitwood and co-produced by Martin Chitwood and another. So that was just a diversion, and during that time I was also practicing law. These are stories that were run in my hometown newspaper. The first one, Martin Chitwood highest score in Fort Benning test. That was the PCPT test. Does anyone here ever take the PCPT test? Okay, yes, Diana did. So it's a physical combat proficiency test. I had 4 training stops where we had the PCPT test. I wanted in 3 of them, including Officer Candidates School. I've never known why I was assigned to Special Forces, but I've always thought that was probably a reason, and I know I would have slowed down. So, next. Shout out to Neil, and to Brett. Brett, you're the man, you make everything happen. Brett recommended us to Neil. We have a plaque that's in process. It will soon be installed at the cross, and the ceremony will invite everyone to attend if you're interested. Elaine and I live on Mount Soledad, and we're pleased to be members of the Kellogg Gang and our unique and non-parallel Beach Club community. Thank all of you very much.
So, I know it's late. If people have questions for Martin, maybe a couple of questions. Go ahead.
Martin?
Cindy?
Yeah. How many of those stories did you do? The special
22. Yeah, 22. And I didn't keep count, but the Army did. They had a special recognition ceremony before I left that said it was 22, so I suppose that's a number. The unique thing about that, in retrospect, is each one of them was supposed to be a life or death situation, but not all of them were, as I told you.
Martin?
Yes.
How do you tell the difference between the friendly Vietnamese, north and south?
Well, that's a very difficult thing. And Jim, you and I have talked about that. And it was one of the things I struggled with a lot is I didn't want to shoot somebody who was on our side. But because the Vietcong, and to the larger extent, the NBA, when we were talking about the NBA arranging an attack on Saigon, what they would do is come to the border, put on civilian clothes, mix with the local population, go to Saigon and infiltrate into Saigon, and you couldn't tell who was friend and who was enemy. So we were very careful about that, but we made friends with the local village people in the area, and we used them to help us identify enemy positions. And of course, we could identify anybody who was moving supplies down the Mekong River system or the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But it was a complicated thing, and we spent a lot of time thinking about that.
Brett?
Hey, Mark, after you were 10 weeks of your initial training, what was the extra training that you guys got when you became a special?
At the Special Warfare School, well, we had two types of training. One of them is in field training. We did, for example, we did night jumps in the Appalachian Mountain with full equipment. And you see people doing, skydiving and things. That's not the way it is when you're doing military jumps. You have a main chute on your back, you have a reserve chute here, and then you carry what will be a backpack for you when you hit the ground. We sometimes were carrying 100 pounds of gear, and we jumped at night in the mountains, the Appalachian Mountains around North Carolina. So I had 18 jumps before I went to Vietnam, and they were training jumps. Another part of it was we had Special Forces is unconventional warfare. We were trained for all the covert operations that you hear about. I mean, Dennis revealed some of the covert things they did. We were trained by the CIA. People drove down in that era from Washington and taught us classes on things like assassinations and other things that the State Department didn't admit that we were involved in. That's part of small team operations.
Did that help your serve at all?
It did not. The biggest help I have had is from you, Brett. I mentioned that Brett played a part in helping us get the plaque for the Mount Soledad, and I want to give you a special shout out, Brett. You make things happen. You're the man. You're my brother in the bond, and you always will be.
The best thing I learned about from Special Forces was line calls with tennis. It's close, Orange County, it's out.
Anything else?